I said something cruel to husband during an argument over child discipline days ago. He is still upset and I may have ruined Christmas. Am I the a-hole? My 31F, husband to Greg, 33M, and I have one child a Jacob is 7M. Greg and I work on different schedules including many weekends, so we spend a lot of time watching Jacob separately. I get him ready in the morning. Greg deals with dinner and bedtime. About a year ago, Greg started occasionally spanking Jacob for discipline when I'm not around, even though he knows I don't agree with it and I have asked him not to. This has happened a few different times over the past year. A few days ago, Greg spanked Jacob again and we had a big argument about it, not in Jacob's presence. I have been frustrated that Greg isn't interested in reading information against spanking. He says that Jacob doesn't care about being sent to his room or a corner, which is somewhat true, and that his behavior issues have improved since this started. Like a cliche, Greg says that he got spanked, he deserved it and turned out fine. Greg's late mother, Diane, even gave babysitters permission to spank her kids and it wasn't a big deal, according to Greg. Anyway, after Greg started referencing his childhood and his mother, I impulsively lashed out and rather harshly reminded him that Diane A. considered him a loser and B. blamed him for her final illness and death. Now, Greg's brother is a primary care doctor who works in the government. Greg works in the financial sector and most likely does better financially than the brother. But over the years that I knew her, Diane was very open in thinking that a financial sector job was nothing compared to any kind of a doctor, and about her bitter disappointment and shame that Greg never got a postgraduate degree. In 2019, Diane was diagnosed with lung cancer despite the fact that she had never smoked. She reacted poorly in terms of mental health and had a rather hysterical response where she questioned whether Greg might be to blame because Greg was the only one in the family who was ever a cigarette smoker, despite the fact that Greg quit years earlier before Jacob was born. Greg believed that he had rarely if ever smoked in front of Diane because she didn't like it, but she claimed that at least once he smoked while driving her in a car on a road trip and that there were other times. Anyway, Diane held Greg at least partly responsible for her lung cancer because of whatever secondhand smoke she experienced from him, and there was a rift between them. Diane even said that she was considering changing her will because Greg wouldn't take responsibility for the secondhand smoke. But before Diane could follow through on that, COVID hit, and while she was being treated for her cancer, she caught COVID during its first wave and went downhill quickly from that instead. Because of COVID, Greg wasn't able to say goodbye or try to repair the rift in person, and there was not even a proper funeral. Even though Greg isn't the one who gave her COVID, which she actually died from, as far as we know, her final comment on Greg was negative and blaming, unfortunately. Anyway, that's the background. I have apologized, but since I said this, Greg has been distant towards me, is sleeping in another room, and I'm worried that I ruined Christmas. Update: the post ended up getting a larger than expected response. That response was turning increasingly negative and I got overwhelmed, so I stopped responding but read most of them. This is a throwaway account, of course. A few things to clarify that maybe I should have explained better in the original post. Where I referred to spanking, I mean that Greg hit our son Jacob, 7 years old second grader, not a 7-month baby, on the rear and using his open hand. I haven't seen any bruising from it. I have done some research and my understanding is, where I live it's unlikely that the Child Protection Agency would intervene even if it was more severe corporal punishment like with a belt, but it isn't not that this isn't already bad. Did Greg do it behind my back? Kind of. Greg works 9 to 5 and my work is mostly late afternoon/evening, and we both sometimes work on weekends too, so our child care time is mostly naturally separate. Greg wasn't secretive about it and told me what happened on each occasion, but continually dismissed me when I tried to explain why it was wrong and he should not. What he did was something that was pretty strongly against my wishes when I wasn't there, and it made me feel like I have to choose between my career and getting in the way of this, so that's why I was angry. To explain further, Greg started the spanking about a year ago when he decided that Jacob had developed understanding of right and wrong and therefore needed punishment when he misbehaved. He did try other things first, like timeout, which was my go-to, quickly decided that those were ineffective and then tried spanking because of his own childhood. Before roughly a year ago, he didn't do much to discipline Jacob at all because he still thought of Jacob as more of a baby. However, what I actually said to Greg in the argument about the spanking was a bit more hurtful than how I described it in the original post. I actually said something like, "You know that Diane died thinking of you as the second-class loser who killed her, right?" So I toned that down a little in the post. I used the phrase second-class loser, not just loser, and the verb kill. In the moment I meant to discredit what Greg was saying about how his mother's pro-spanking parenting was fine, but the comment was pretty strong from Greg's POV and I do understand that. I was alluding to the fact that Greg's brother was the more favored child to Diane, at least once they grew up, and because Greg's brother is a doctor. Greg never had closure over Diane's death and her blaming him at the end of her life, and this is an extremely sore subject for him, which I am well aware of. Also, I want to clarify that at the time of my last post, I did not want to speak to a mandated reporter-type person, mainly because I thought that Greg would feel ganged up on if I had him meet with someone who sided with me about the spanking, like any mental health professional, and that would be the wrong move after what I said. Again, I don't think our family would be in legal jeopardy based on this where I live, but it's also true that anyone can report for anything. You never know what other people will do, and if someone like that tried, it would be stressful and put further pressure on my marriage, to say the least. Breaking up the family or more stressful issues isn't what I want. Anyway, Greg and I talked before Christmas Eve. He said that he still needed time to cool off and think on his own, but he agreed to pretend that everything was fine between us until after the holidays for Jacob and because our other relatives were around. So we play-acted our way through Christmas, and I think that was the right thing to do for Jacob. 3 days ago we had our talk. Basically, I apologized, but he didn't, and we are where we started as far as the spanking issue goes. Greg feels he did nothing wrong. He acknowledges going against me, but he doesn't think we have to obey each other, and that it's normal for a mother and father to have different parenting styles and levels of strictness. He still isn't going outside his information bubble or taking research into consideration. He says he doesn't want to give up on our marriage because it's important for him that Jacob grows up in an intact home, but what I said made him question whether I love him as much as he loves me, and he is still very hurt that I would say that. I have tried many times to reassure him, but he is still cool towards me. So as for our marriage, Greg has agreed to start therapy for himself at my urging, but it will not be couples therapy or anything focused on his parenting. After he has done that for a while, he will consider doing couples therapy with me. And that's my update.